Okay, before we get started, I'm just gonna address the elephant in the room. I know that I'm not the first person to make this video. I found the other one while I was writing this. However, I haven't watched this video yet, and I did all my own research and writing. Shout out to the fine folks at the Sonic Wiki Zone for creating a wonderful starting point for that. The thing is, I put a lot of effort into what I thought was a very fun, if not completely unique, idea that I am very excited for, so just let me have this one. Sonic the Hedgehog 1 is one of the most iconic and influential games of all time. It almost single-handedly made the Sega Genesis a success. It ended Nintendo's chokehold on the video game market. It turned Sega into an industry titan. It launched a franchise that has remained a pillar of the industry to this day. And it created a fan base that damn near ruined the entire internet. Sonic 1, alongside all of its sequels and spin-offs and whatever you call and Knuckles, was one of the biggest titles of the era and has gone down in history as an icon of the retro world. And much like any iconic retro title, like the Pac-Mans and the Donkey Kongs and the Mega Mans and the Mario Bros. Onesies, it has been re-released a lot. A lot. Like maybe too much. It's on every console, in every retro store, every eBay listing, every game collecting video. Someone has even been putting it in my fridge. This game is impossible to escape. And I've finally given up on trying. And now that I have, I can't help but wonder just how many versions of Sonic the Hedgehog 1 are there? Surely it's like 3, right? The original 16-bit Sega Genesis version of Sonic the Hedgehog 1 would of course be released on the Sega Genesis in the summer of 1991, where it would find insane and unprecedented levels of critical and commercial success, generate tons of new attention for the then struggling Sega Genesis, and almost single-handedly overthrow Nintendo as the industry's only dominant console manufacturer. It was a massive cultural phenomenon that is still having an effect on the gaming industry to this day. Not long after, the original version of Sonic 1 would also be backwards ported to Sega's original home console, the Master System. For all 3 people who owned a Master System, or at least that's what they claimed. This is a fundamentally different release than the Sega Genesis version. Built from the ground up to run on 8-bit hardware, it's a much less substantial title, with less content, shorter levels, simpler visuals, worse music, and surprisingly enough, 3 entire zones that were never in the original game. This version also ended up getting ported to the Game Gear, Sega's more powerful and more colorful answer to Nintendo's Game Boy, complete with a larger form factor, a shorter battery life, a higher price point, and no Pokemon games. Guess which one sold better? But these were far from the only releases of Sonic 1 during this generation. Not only did Sega re-release this game on the same console with no changes 4 years later as a part of the Sega Classics line, but they also released 3 separate compilation cartridges that all included copies of Sonic the Hedgehog 1, because I guess 4 would have just been excessive. Say what you will about Sega back then, but they were never one to shy away from giving their fans a good deal. And over 30 years later, that hasn't changed at all. And this kind of game compilation would actually become common practice for Sega, as they would consistently put out Genesis compilations on any system that would take them. But only Genesis compilations. Because I guess that's the only console Sega really cares about. Of course, Saturn, Dreamcast, and even Game Gear games do get the occasional re-release, but even then it doesn't happen nearly as often, and only Game Gear games ever seem to make it into compilations these days. And then, of course, if you're a fan of the Master System, why? The game also received an arcade port, which no one ever seems to talk about. It's actually a very interesting release, being a near-perfect replica with a few arcadey additions like a time limit and a high score screen. A big-name home console game like Sonic being released in arcades might seem a little odd these days, especially considering how many developers seem to be competing to see who could bring the most arcade games to home consoles. But this sort of thing actually happened a lot back then. For example, Super Mario Bros., And that makes two. Sega's next mainline console, the Sega Saturn, got a few notable Sonic spin-offs, but infamously did not receive a new mainline Sonic the Hedgehog game, leaving the system with a massive, gaping hole in its library that in no small part contributed to the system's well-documented failure. If we could all real quick partake in a quick moment of silence, we will have done more for the Sega Saturn than Sega ever did. That was mean. Who said that? But what it did receive was another Sonic Genesis compilation in the form of Sonic Jam, not to be confused with NBA Jam, which I think was basically the same thing. This release featured the entire Genesis trilogy and Knuckles, complete with some minor level tweaks and gameplay enhancements. It still wasn't comparable to a brand new mainline 3D release like the adventure games on the upcoming Sega Dreamcast, but it was still better than nothing. I think. I wasn't alive yet. Sega's fourth and final console also received its own compilation, the Sega Smash Pack Volume 1, featuring Sonic 1 alongside 8 other iconic Sega Genesis games, the Saturn release of Virtua Cop, and the Dreamcast original puzzle game Sega Swirl, which we will talk about next week. This release was meant to provide younger gamers, all of whom are now older than I am, with the chance to explore the iconic and rapidly aging library of Sega's most influential console, while also fleshing out the Dreamcast's frankly small and arguably underwhelming library at a time when Sega was struggling to maintain a consistent output of new games for the system. I mean, Sega was doing fine. They were doing a great job. It was everyone else who wasn't releasing Dreamcast games. After the genuinely devastating failure of the Dreamcast, you deserved better. Sega fully dedicated themselves to third-party development, consistently putting out a large and diverse roster of great releases across the platforms that were once their greatest competition, and re-cementing themselves as a titan of the industry even without a console to call their own. And they never seemed to miss an opportunity to put Sonic 1 on every system they could. For example, this same generation saw 4, but technically 5, more releases. When Sega first left the console hardware market, they tried to port a significant portion of their existing library to the systems that their future titles would soon be calling home. Amongst these ports were Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 from the Dreamcast. Released exclusively on GameCube and eventually PC, the director's cut of Sonic Adventure 1 included the entirety of the 8-bit version of Sonic the Hedgehog as an unlockable reward. Ah yes, Sega's latest and greatest Sonic title, bringing fans all the way back to the original release on the Game Gear. No, that sounds right. And then, that version of Sonic Adventure later got re-released as part of the Sonic Adventure 2-pack that contained both the GameCube releases of Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, including the 8-bit port of Sonic the Hedgehog 1. Can't say I don't know what I'm talking about. I remember the Sonic the Hedgehog 2-pack. Of course, 8-bit Sonic is great and all, but if you wanted to play the real original 16-bit Sonic the Hedgehog on GameCube, Sega also released the Sonic Mega Collection, which, as its name implies, features the entire Genesis trilogy and Knuckles, as well as Spinball, 3D Blast, Mean Bean Machine, the bonus games from the original trilogy, and a few extra Genesis games. You know, as a little treat for being such a good little guy. Can you say yum? And that collection, originally exclusive to GameCube, was later ported to PS2 and Xbox with a bunch of extra games as Sonic Mega Collection Plus. Because fuck GameCube fans, I guess. And not only does this absolutely count as another release, it also now included the 8-bit version of Sonic the Hedgehog 1. And then, the original Xbox also received a dual-pack release of Super Monkey Ball Deluxe and Sonic Mega Collection Plus, with 8-bit Sonic 1. And sure, we'll count that one too. The PS2 and PSP also received a proper Genesis collection, creatively titled Sega Genesis collection. And featuring, you guessed it, a collection of Sega games, including but not limited to the one we've been talking about this entire time. Around the same time, actually 2 days before the PSP version of the Sega Genesis collection, the 16-bit version of Sonic 1 received its first ever portable release on the Game Boy Advance. A port that was so poorly coded and even more poorly received that fans had to step in themselves to make a partial version that actually functioned. Remember this, it will be important later. And then a few years later on the Nintendo DS, Sega attempted to redeem themselves with the Sonic Classics Collection. I bought this at a Goodwill. A compilation featuring the entire Genesis trilogy and Knuckles. This was supposed to be a huge step up from the GBA release, attempting to run all 4 games on a single cartridge when Nintendo's last handheld couldn't even handle one. And instead, it proved once and for all that it wasn't even the GBA's fault. Moving on to the Wii, Nintendo's former best-selling console of all time ended up missing out on a lot of the franchise's best releases this generation. But it did its best to make up for it with exclusive titles like Sonic and the Secret Rings and Sonic and the Black Knight. So make of that what you will. But more importantly, the Wii also received exclusive releases of both the Genesis and Game Gear versions of Sonic 1 through the Nintendo Virtual Console, a Nintendo exclusive line of digital re-releases of classic games from across Nintendo's retro library and the libraries of a few other companies that had long since exited the console manufacturing business. Companies like Sega. And surely that makes up for not getting Sonic Generations. This generation as a whole was actually kind of a big one for Sonic 1 re-releases, with the Wii getting 2 and the PS3 and Xbox getting more than that. For starters, both systems received digital-only re-releases of Sonic 1 through PlayStation Plus and Xbox Live Arcade respectively, because I guess the Virtual Console wasn't that unique after all, with the PS3 version eventually being made available for purchase through more traditional means. Both systems also received yet another Genesis compilation in the form of Sonic's Ultimate Genesis Collection. And if you're wondering if this release also included Sonic 1, it's literally in the name. And then, of course, there was Sonic Generations. Oh boy. Okay, Sonic Generations was the Sonic franchise's big 20th anniversary title. It was a love letter to the entire franchise featuring a who's who of iconic and beloved levels from all across the Sonic franchise, and also Planet Wisp. Fuck Planet Wisp. The original console release of the game also included the entirety of Sonic the Hedgehog 1 as an unlockable reward right at the start of the game. But it doesn't end there, because this version of Sonic 1 was notably absent from all other versions of the game. The PC release, the 3DS release, which is a completely different game and a much longer story, and even the 2024 release of Sonic X Shadow Generations. But I can officially confirm after a bit of research that this game was indeed included in the original releases of Sonic Generations on PS3 and Xbox 360, which is just very cool. I love when developers do things like this for their anniversary titles. All that to say that if you played this version of Sonic Generations on PS3 or Xbox and then migrated to any of its other releases and were confused when Sonic 1 wasn't there, you're not crazy, or at the very least, you're exactly as sane as I am. Okay, sorry about that. And the Wii, of course, didn't get any of these releases, but it also didn't get 06, so maybe that worked out for the best. The Wii U, on the other hand, didn't get any releases of Sonic 1, not even through Virtual Console, because it was too busy getting Sonic Boom. The 3DS, however, did receive its own Virtual Console release of Sonic 1 in the form of the 8-bit Game Gear version. Because it's a handheld! That's so cute! But it also received another, more unique version, which was not branded as a part of the system's Virtual Console library, and is a way more complicated story. Basically, Nintendo wanted to show off their latest system's cool new gimmick, the 3DS's stereoscopic 3D capabilities. Nintendo developed a handful of 3D pixel art remakes of classic NES games known as 3D Classics. There were 6 games in total: Kirby's Adventure, Kid Icarus, Excitebike, Urban Champion, Twin Bee, and Xevious. And if you've never heard of Twin Bee or Xevious, don't feel bad, these remakes are the only reason I even know these games exist. It was a very weird experiment that ended almost as soon as it began and oddly missed out on a lot of the NES's most iconic and influential titles like Mario and Zelda, as well as the NES titles that would have most benefited from the addition of 3D graphics like Punch-Out and Rad Racer. But hey, at least we got another way to play fucking Urban Champion. What would we do without you? Sega saw this idea and liked it so much that they once again dedicated a significant amount of time and effort to beating Nintendo at their own game. It's just like the Sega Genesis all over again. Where Nintendo could barely manage to release 6 titles of varying quality, Sega put out a whopping 29, all of which were iconic Sega games, several of which were perfect and obvious choices for this kind of remake, and all of which were released under the title of Sega 3D Classics, because they weren't even trying to hide it. And of course, one of the games that they remade was the original 16-bit version of Sonic the Hedgehog. And when Sega re-released these remakes as physical compilations, this remake of Sonic 1 found its way into the second compilation, which was also the only one released outside of Japan. Okay, we're almost done with traditional systems, so let's take a quick detour to talk about some of the more unorthodox releases, starting with the mini consoles. In the late 2010s, also known as, oh my god, it's been that long, a lot of longtime console manufacturers started producing miniature plug-and-play reproductions of their old-school classic consoles, complete with large preloaded rosters of those consoles' most iconic classic titles. It started out with Nintendo making the NES and Super Nintendo Classic Editions, and then Sony put out the PlayStation Classic, which didn't do too well, and even the GOATs at SNK put out the Neo Geo Mini. I mean, technically the Neo Geo Mini came out first, but you wouldn't know that if I wasn't telling you right now. And Sega, seemingly never missing out on an opportunity to rip Nintendo's shit and make it better, released the Sega Genesis Mini, complete with 40 iconic Sega Genesis games, including Sonic 1, and also a never-before-released Sega Genesis version of Tetris, which we will also talk about next week. This was actually a pretty big deal, mostly because of the large library of iconic titles, but also because up until this point, Sega didn't have the best track record with licensed plug-and-plays. Oh, we're gonna get to it. Not really. Needless to say, they broke the curse and then never made another plug-and-play again. And then, a few years later, Sega released a line of Game Gear Micros exclusively in Japan, and it is exactly what it sounds like. A miniature reproduction of the Sega Game Gear, complete with 4 preloaded games. 4? Why even make it at that point? The handheld was released in 4 separate colors, with each color having its own unique lineup of games, because that's not confusing. And the black unit specifically contained the 8-bit release of Sonic the Hedgehog 1. And the red one had Megami Tensei? What? This is honestly such a weird and interesting little footnote in Sega's history, and I could probably talk about these things for hours. Do you guys like my new shirt? Okay, lightning round. iPod release, browser release, 4 separate plug-and-play releases that I could actually find from back when Sega was still licensing their Genesis games to anyone with a pulse. 2. Japan-exclusive mobile release through the now-defunct Sonic Cafe service. A worldwide mobile release under the now-defunct Sega Mobile banner. A 3rd now-defunct mobile release exclusively for iPhones. A mobile release of the Game Gear version for the Palm OS. Please don't ask me what a Palm OS is, I don't know. A Genesis collection released both on Steam and through CD-ROM, another PC compilation, this one exclusive to Australia and New Zealand, that actually technically contains 3 versions of Sonic 1. I'm not losing count, you're losing count. Yet another mobile release, this time exclusive to something called the Kyocera Echo, which of course is a name that I'm sure we're all familiar with. 2 separate Tiger Electronic handheld games that both play exactly as well as you would expect a Tiger Electronics handheld game to play. A digital-only Nintendo Switch release that isn't even a part of Nintendo Switch Online's Sega Genesis collection because it's its own separate paid release as a part of the Sega Ages branding. A Tesla release because I guess we're doing fucking cars now. And of course, a fan favorite, the final, at least as of 2025, mobile release of Sonic the Hedgehog, the Christian Whitehead version. And if that is a name you recognize, nerd! Okay, fine, I'll talk about it. Christian Whitehead is a bit of a celebrity in the Sonic fanbase. He's worked on a few fan projects over the years, but for a while there, he was mostly known for his creation of the Retro Engine, a wholly original, fully customized 2D focused engine that he used to create a nearly one-to-one remake of Sonic CD completely from scratch for mobile devices. Sega, of course, upon discovering that a fan was remaking their games, promptly drove to his house, shot him in the head, and proceeded to sue his corpse into the ground. Kidding. They actually hired him. Not only to officially release his remake of Sonic CD on mobile devices, but also to create enhanced remakes of Sonic 1 and 2 in his custom engine, also for mobile devices. A pair of remakes that the Sonic fanbase widely considers to be the best versions of these games. A fact that only becomes more impressive with the context of just how many versions have been released. That's right, this entire video was actually secretly an excuse to gush about Christian fucking Whitehead, the first ever good Sonic fan. Christian Whitehead and Sega as a whole would later team up with indie studio Headcanon, a studio primarily made up of Sonic fan game developers and founded by Simon Stealth Tomley, who just so happens to be the guy that made the Game Boy Advance fan game we talked about earlier. I hope you've been studying because there's going to be a quiz later. This dream team would go on to create Sonic Mania, one of the best Sonic games ever made, a breath of fresh air in what was quickly becoming one of the franchise's darkest eras, my personal favorite Sonic game of all time, and one of the coolest things a major studio has ever done with one of their IPs. And it all happened because one guy wanted to put Sonic CD, of all games, on his phone. And the story doesn't even end there, because that team went on to create the most recent, for now, Sonic compilation, Sonic Origins, available on all modern and most last-gen systems, is yet another Sonic Genesis collection. This time featuring enhanced ports of Whitehead's remakes of Sonic 1, 2, and CD, as well as a brand new top-to-bottom remaster of Sonic 3 and Knuckles, alongside a boatload of bonus features, a handful of brand new cutscenes, and a ton of original side content. And then the compilation got re-released a year later with even more bonus content, playable Amy Rose, and all 12 Sonic the Hedgehog Game Gear titles, including the 8-bit version of Sonic the Hedgehog. And I don't know what upsets me more: Sega releasing a full-priced enhanced version of an existing game a year after launch, like their Atlas milking Persona titles, or the fact that the 8-bit version of Sonic the Hedgehog has been re-released enough times to be its own video. Either way, that is the last and most recent official release of Sonic the Hedgehog 1, unless Sega decides to put out Sonic Origins Plus in the week it takes me to edit this headache of a video. So that brings the grand total number of times that Sonic the Hedgehog 1 has been remade, remastered, or re-released a whopping 52 times. And if that rabbit hole doesn't give you a headache, nothing will. I'm gonna go take a nap. See you all in a week.